Tim, for joining us.
Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. Yeah, and we're really happy to be here to share on this work that we've been intersecting with a bit in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Tim, but I think Chris has given us introductions, so I'll just turn it to Tim to get going.
Okay,
Over to you.
sure. Yeah, great. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully. Oh no, wrong screen. You're seeing the mania of organization there. Let's see. Are you seeing a slide deck now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks for uh, giving us the opportunity to come in and talk about these projects. Let's see. Did that go full screen for everybody when I did that or no? No.
Yes.
So sorry. Give me one sec. Let's see. Hopefully that is a full but unexciting slide. They get better right after this. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Chris, and good to be here with everybody. I'm going to start us off by talking about the first of two Bay Area efforts that Lisa and I are going to share, and then at the end have hopefully just some good conversation and exchange about commonalities or relationships to some of the work going on by everyone on the call. So I'm going to start by describing a project in North Richmond, California, called the Collaborative Shoreline Plan and Living Levee. A little bit of geography for folks who may know or not know the San Francisco Bay Area. So North Richmond is in the north end of San Francisco Bay, technically fronting San Pablo Bay. And it's north of Berkeley, north of the city of Richmond. It's an unincorporated area of Contra Costa County. So no city government, just county agency oversights. It's a neighborhood that developed uh, after World War II primarily. So Black families that moved to California for the shipbuilding effort in California during World War II, and then through racist housing practices were redlined into an area now called North Richmond that was already a low-lying, topographically low-lying area adjacent to Wildcat Marsh. And it's also downwind from a Chevron refinery, which you can see sort of in the distance of this bird's eye here, just to give you a little sense of the grain of the scale of the community and its proximity to marsh ecosystems. Um, a little bit of a historic pullback here. This is from around 1852, if I remember right. So gives a sense of that part of the San Pablo Bay and this complex of marshes that would have come together through three creeks primarily. You'll hear me talk a bit about Wildcat Creek, which if you can see my cursor is this blue strand here. San Pablo Creek, Castro Creek all came together in this marsh complex. And then this purple line gives you a sense of roughly the contemporary shoreline, so the amount of fill that's happened. And then our project study area roughly in red as it relates to the residential community. Um, Flood resilience and other sea level rise risks are really acute here. This is a couple of different horizons for sea level rise prediction from the California Ocean Protections Council, which is sort of the current governing models for adaptation in California. So the highest points you see there are 3.5 feet of sea level rise with a 100-year storm. Because of the that background of racist housing practices and environmental justice issues in the community, and the fact that it's been not never incorporated, and so its access to sort of representation on a city level has never been there. The community has and the community has built its own legacy of advocacy in the way that they have worked for self-determination as it relates to environmental issues and housing issues. Methuen, and myself personally, have been working with the community for almost 10 years now on a whole host of different interrelated projects. It's a real honor to continue to be invited back into this community. So now to talk a little bit more about the project specific here to the opportunities for multi-benefits around sea level rise, adaptation, infrastructure. We're looking here in a bird's eye. That's Wildcat Creek in the foreground, and in orange there is the West County Wastewater Treatment District. And so this is the wastewater infrastructure for about 100,000 people in this part of the bay, and particularly for that North Richmond community that I've mentioned. It's adjacent to Wildcat Marsh, and so its vulnerability to sea level rise is quite early. They already endure coastal flooding issues on king tide days, and so it's a critical sort of piece of infrastructure to help protect. And then it's also the future flooding pathway for it's sort of the front line of the future flooding pathway for the residential community. And I mentioned that we've been doing this in kinship with this community for almost 10 years. There's been a lot of sort of shoulder to shoulder learning and a lot of co-design invested in this approach to multi-benefit infrastructure. This is just a couple of the variations that have happened. It's transcended COVID time, which you can sort of see from the masks in the Zoom screens on this slide. We've done a lot of drawing side by side. We've done a lot of seminars helping community members elevate their own knowledge about engineering and design practices for adaptation so that they can participate in a sort of full way with the design team and with the agencies that approve this kind of work. And so the intent here has been to take community lived experience and pull it up to where it's operating at along the same lines as the engineering and design expertise in the project. And just to note that the community members have been compensated for their hours spent on the project over those years as well, at a rate roughly akin to engineers and designers. And so this is a sort of looking at the kind of culmination of the planning effort here. So again, the residential neighborhood is sort of here. This is West County Wastewater. And we've identified this, if you can sort of track this pink line, represents the flood protection measure. So the core of a shoreline levee, and then the layers of green that extend marshward from there are describing the opportunity for marsh migration slopes and ecotone slopes to promote marsh health with the rising seas. And in the center of this plan, circled in white, the phase 1 living levee is the sort of first piece of that project that's moving forward. It's currently in construction documents and in coordination with permitting agencies. And so the idea here of multiple benefits of coastal flooding protection, of marsh migration, of improved access to the shoreline for community residents, upgraded trails and boardwalks, education opportunities, and improved green stormwater function at the kind of neighborhood level happening on the landward side of the levee approach. This just gives you a kind of sense of the components of it, with sort of the key habitat feature being this gracious slope that extends towards the bay, allowing for marsh migration to happen. And then just looking at it from closer to a bird's eye view, closer to an eye level view, to get a sense of the intended richness of all those habitats, and the potential for the community to have a new experience that they really don't have right now, and to have a reconnection to their shoreline that was cut off by industrial development over the decades. And so I'm going to hand it there over to Lisa to talk about some work she's doing in the city of San Francisco.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so sort of recognizing that there are similar challenges that communities across the country are facing, and that, you know, to put this type of a plan into place really requires new approaches and a co-creation of solutions. So the World Resources Institute, in partnership with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission here, embarked on an effort to kind of develop and test a new model for collaboration between city agencies and communities to deliver this type of resilient infrastructure. And the model, the Joint Benefits Authority, or JBA, was really intending to break down those silos between different government institutions and include the community as an actual project partner in decision making, and create that sort of framework for co-designing solutions. So this work began in 2019, and I have to recognize that it was really generously funded by the Kresge Foundation and Spring Point Partners and the Moore Foundation. And so, you know, the team progressed towards a pilot in San Francisco, and although we haven't put that JBA into practice, you know, yet, there's been a lot of insights and from this process, and that's what I wanted to share a little bit of here, and happy also to share a link later to the lessons learned document. So as a landscape architect and a city planner, you know, an iterative design thinking process helped us to really advance this concept. And we started by defining the problem, and then, you know, gathering inspiration, ideating on solutions, testing those ideas with stakeholders, identifying pilots, and then we're here now kind of finally sharing the lessons learned. And so each of these phases sort of progressed and then moved back and progressed again. And so just to take to the next slide, we really wanted to understand kind of the challenges cities are facing. So what the key drivers impacting cities' abilities to deliver on resilient infrastructure. Next. And you all are wildly familiar, I'm sure, with these main issues, but, you know, climate change is here, right? Events are happening more often and with more intensity. Sadly, urbanization is also, you know, increasing impermeable surfaces, and changed land uses are really degrading our ecosystems. That, along with aging infrastructure, means that we're seeing kind of unprecedented coastal and urban flooding and erosion. So here on the left, you're looking at the Ocean Beach in San Francisco, and then one of our very popular parks, Mission Dolores, with a biker, you know, biking to work through at least a foot of water. And then next to that, you know, the issues of heat and air quality have also really been on the rise. So even in San Francisco, this is incredibly poor air quality that has been a, you know, more common experience as fires are occurring more frequently. And unfortunately, these are, you know, the impacts that are hitting, you know, the most vulnerable and underserved communities. But also, there's a lot of governance and financing challenges that cities really struggle with, especially in delivering kind of affordable and equitable public services. And, you know, the siloed effects of city departments, the rising cost of construction, and lack of kind of secure dollars for ongoing maintenance is really challenging for especially landscape infrastructure when we're looking at resilience. So these are really big challenges. They require sort of, you know, really intensely collaborative solutions. And most often our cities are, you know, pretty much aligned, and its departments are aligned, you know, kind of working towards the same goals, right? To deliver projects that ensure public health and safety, you know, community well-being, environmental stewardship, and, you know, exhibit good governance. But even though we're trying, it's not always working. So on the next slide, we can see that we did an evaluation of benefits and the role that different agencies play in planning and implementing these, which really highlight a number of gaps between what communities are really desiring in terms of outcomes, and then the alignment with city departments' missions and mandates. And so on the chart here, we have kind of a set of three outcomes related to community health and well-being, environmental, environmental improvements, and good governance. And then each of the rows on the left-hand side are related to agencies that are responsible for either planning or implementation of public infrastructure. And so the dots sort of show where missions and mandates are aligned, and you see a lot of these areas that have gray boxes where, entire sort of benefits or outcomes that are, that are the desire of our communities are not really being met by the role of our agencies. So, if we look at the outcomes around parks and forestry and green infrastructure, there are several departments that have a role, right, in planning, implementing, and managing. We've got the planning department, the parks department, utilities, urban forestry, public works, but each have a piece of the responsibility. And because they're in different hands, there isn't always a single vision. And so separating, jurisdictions and funding means that, our resulting green spaces and corridors and natural lands aren't necessarily coordinated or really able to take full advantage of the benefits that parks, trees, stormwater management solutions at that type of scale can bring to communities. And similarly, you can see that on the right-hand side, much of the desired outcomes around good governance are like aligned investments and limited community disruption don't really fall into any one person's hands. So next, we just took a look at what tools are already out there that exist for collaboration on project delivery. And there's a range of models that cities and regions employ to collaborate among agencies or between government and the private sector and community. There are individually led efforts and also collaborative and combinations of these key partners. But, I think many of these models are focused on what I would call coordination, right? Cities generally are aiming to avoid conflicts in infrastructure development by using coordinating committees or tracking tools to make sure that, projects are not impacting others. But in contrast, collaboration, right, is actually a collective process where you're ideating and designing and delivering and managing together. And these processes are much harder to find success in. So one of our goals was really in terms of the envisioning a collaborative governance. So on the next slide, just sort of lays out that definition. And so what we are defining a collaborative governing arrangement where public agencies, one or more public agencies are, directly engaging with non-government stakeholders in collective decision-making, right? And that's through a formal process that should be consensus-oriented. Here we're highlighting kind of 6 important criteria, the first being initiation by public agencies or institutions, but that non-government actors and stakeholders are included. Those participants are engaged directly in decision-making as opposed to, I think, what was typical consultation, and that there's some sort of formal organization that embeds in it inclusive engagement. But the intent is really to prioritize decisions by consensus, and collaboration is really focused on public policy or public management or public project delivery. So here, the co-definition of problems and the co-development of solutions really is the opportunity to amplify the benefits and increase capacity for both implementation that is grounded in community strengths, but also in the assets that are already there. So when we looked at cities and considered what some of the kind of existing tools for joint public projects. On the left-hand side, you'll see our standard instrument is typically an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, and that really doesn't provide much in terms of collaboration because often it comes kind of later in the project once you've defined what the project is and lay out whose roles and responsibilities are there. So we focused on a few case studies of what we considered transformational projects that created physical change in the city landscape that maximized like the social and environmental co-benefits and also potentially reduce costs by building in multi-purpose projects. And so we were looking at 3 kind of key models as a starting point as we developed this concept of the JBA. The first really was about kind of a new city agency, and this is a little bit like in San Francisco, the Treasure Island Development Authority. But we also looked at cities across the country and across the world to get to see some of these really transformational projects that often embedded sort of nature as a tool for resilience. And so one of those is Orestad, which is a community sort of south of Copenhagen in Denmark, and is focused on kind of development around kind of water and so the entire site is really developed around water management and therefore nature and natural infrastructure. Additionally, we looked at the Seattle waterfront, which had its own sort of agency in order to deliver on a massive project there where they took down a viaduct and reconnected the city to that shoreline. And so having kind of one agency responsible for large-scale delivery. Another model that really was probably most influential in defining the Joint Benefits Authority is the Joint Powers Authority model. And this is a kind of a regional collaborative tool or coordination tool that brings together multiple agencies into kind of one mission. It's geographically based and it is collectively organized. So it's based on an interest in participating, a sort of co-funding of the use of that JBA, which would typically be used for program delivery or project delivery. So here in San Francisco, the Transbay project was a project that we kind of looked to as an example, but we also looked farther away. And so, we looked at Bishan Park, which is in Singapore, and it's a collaboration between the Water Department and the Parks Department to kind of really relook at this spine of stormwater management that was reimagined as a sort of wetland complex to both manage the water, but also create park space and connect neighborhoods. In addition, we looked to Atlanta's historic Fourth Ward Park, which was kind of a similar collaboration between parks and utility to address stormwater management while also providing the public amenity of a park that could be used by that neighborhood and really elevated the neighborhood. The final model that we've looked at, and this is actually defunct in San Francisco at this point, but it's redevelopment, right? So looking at the redevelopment authority, which San Francisco had under its, and California had been using as a tool up until maybe 15 years ago. But, the idea is that you have one project team sort of looking at the redevelopment, both in economics and utilities and infrastructure, housing, parks, etc. But they're sort of responsible to the city to follow rules and regulations, and yet are able to make sort of large-scale transformative change. And so this is a little bit similar to the Cheonggyecheong River, which is River Park in Seoul, where they took down a major freeway and really opened up this former stream into a massive public park, which both sort of addresses, sort of the public amenity for communities, but also made major changes in terms of lowering temperatures in the levels of degrees, and providing new opportunity for economic development along that corridor that was mostly just providing massive transportation corridor that was polluting the air and otherwise. And as a complement, they developed a massive bus system to ensure that transportation wasn't impacted, but that there was still an opportunity, just a different way of transportation. As well as Hunters Point South Park in New York City, which was part of a development program, but really kind of the edge condition along the East River was an important kind of buffer for that development site related to climate change, and as it was in place in construction as Sandy went through and really withheld itself. So each of these was sort of a deep dive into understanding what kinds of models are out there. And I think for us, what we wanted to really pull out was what does it take? What do these things have in common? And I think there were three ingredients that emerged. One was really about the vision. Each of these had a large scale plan for transformation. The second is about leadership and just recognizing that none of this work moves forward without a key person or a department, either in the city or community that, you know, really champions the effort and moves it along. And not only do you need the leadership, but you need that political will, the folks to like come behind it and participate. And these are really hard to, I think, sort of hone and get together on all three of them. So as we advanced into thinking about the Joint Benefits Authority, this was really framing our thinking there. So on the next slide, just to introduce briefly the Joint Benefits Authority and you know, sort of how we're doing business today and how we might do it in the future. So our business as usual on the next slide is probably familiar to you. This image is a piece of the landscape of San Francisco in the sort of mid-southeast area. And you'll see the colors on the map are related to different agencies within the city that have responsibility for delivering on public infrastructure, right? So the transit agency in red is responsible for dealing with our high injury corridors. And so they're doing, you know, signing and striping improvements to ensure better safety. And the schools in purple are, you know, responsible for keeping obviously kids safe and students safe and in the buildings. And so their focus is really on building upgrades. The utilities, which you see in blue here, are managing stormwater, and so they're upsizing pipes and other things to deal with flood areas or areas that are sort of tending to flood. And then parks in green, is really responsible for recreation, and so they're making sort of drainage improvements to ensure that fields can be utilized. And so each of these agencies is committing their funding, right, to achieve these sort of single benefits. So what we envisioned was something different, and that's the JBA approach. And so here it's the idea of all those agencies coming together, right, in partnership with those communities, so people that are on the ground, to look at a neighborhood challenge holistically in order to come up with solutions that can actually, increase benefits as well as bring in, additional partners. So, instead of signing and striping, resources are pooled and you end up looking for complete and green streets, safe routes to school, right, green stormwater management, even lighting for safety. And instead of upsizing pipes, the project could actually bring that stormwater to the surface with a creek daylighting project in this area that both kind of can handle management of the stormwater, but also creates walking and biking opportunities and addresses biodiversity and heat potentially. And then, instead of thinking about schools as just improvements to the buildings, thinking about them as actual resources for the community as kind of, sustainable schoolyards and really a community asset. So this is just to show that if we could actually pool all the resources across these different departments, we would have the opportunity to really build and amplify the benefits and potentially draw in additional dollars that might not be part of typical public infrastructure by department. So in addition to kind of the philanthropy and state grants, there are things like the Department of Health or the Department of Environment that aren't typically engaged in infrastructure investments, but are very much invested in these benefits and outcomes. So the JBA was really built on kind of four key elements: the establishing this integrated project delivery by using advanced capital planning, so bringing folks together early in the process to actually ideate on what are the challenges and the solutions. That meant capturing the co-benefits also by really quantifying a lot of those unmeasured benefits that come from multi-purpose projects. We also focused on this creative municipal financing by, sort of drawing additional and new investors, as well as kind of strategies to think about supporting projects through their life cycle, not just into the delivery of a project. And then critical was really advancing social equity by, bringing the community into the decision-making process that actually is responsible for, shaping their neighborhoods. So just re-looking at those three keys to transformation, the JBA, we felt like the JBA could be a tool to really really achieve those, right? Like you have a vision because you're creating this district scale improvement with the JBA. There's a single team, one project team that's sort of sitting under this leadership from the JBA, as well as sort of the collaboration and collaborative partnership between the community and the city to really ensure that that political will is there. So one of the key things that we did during this process was we had built out this idea of the JBA. We had done a lot of research and understood kind of what the mechanics of building a JBA would be. But on the next slide, you can see we went through an extensive process of interviews with several cities. So we really wanted to kind of ground our research and make sure that it was relevant, not just in San Francisco, but to cities across the country. And so we facilitated a series of interviews and really mostly to learn about what other cities were doing, what kind of barriers they were experiencing to integrated project delivery. And we asked kind of a series of questions around 6 key topics: governance and joint capital projects, green infrastructure, capital projects, community resilience, the legal, finance, and communities roles. And so kind of distilling these conversations, and we met with at least 50 individuals over this period, we then synthesized that insights into a set of kind of common barriers and enabling conditions. So in terms of those sort of barriers, and I have a feeling these will be pretty relevant. I'm curious if you all have experienced these, but these 6 really came out strong. So, misalignment of priorities is a challenge to collaboration, right? It's really difficult to get kind of alignment on priorities and timelines, especially because city agencies are all doing their own capital planning efforts. And so that is difficult. And agencies are often sort of trained to stay in their lane, right? Not to expand. The second thing is about limited funding or limitations on spending funds. And so this is really where it's, kind of difficult, and our inability to pool resources across agencies and across types of funding. So typically in a city, the general fund and revenue fund agencies, it's very hard to make those mixes. And, in low resource cities, everyone's going after a small or smaller limited funding pot. Also, insufficient staff capacity. We know that often our agency staff are really already overcommitted, and so they don't have the time to kind of think about new ideas or innovative approaches. And then there's not really a structure or framework for kind of sharing across agencies, this sort of like knowledge building around complex implementation. The fourth is about the shifting political priorities and support. And of course, administrations change and therefore priorities change. So this type of work, which is very long-term, is difficult, right, to maintain. And then this one is particularly, the fifth one is particularly kind of key for me. I've seen it most impactfully sort of deterring coordination and collaboration is the disconnection between planning and implementation. So we have a lot of great plans, but I think often that planning work is very disconnected from the folks who are actually implementing, operating infrastructure. And so, the ability to take from plan to realization of public infrastructure is really a challenge, and people get exhausted with the planning, right? Over planning, but a lot of plans just end up sitting on a shelf because they didn't engage that whole team process. And then finally, just as we talked earlier, the gaps in responsibility for delivering benefits, right? So if the benefits aren't really aligning with the landowner, you really need to have partnerships. So some of the barriers, but also we discovered a number of kind of what we called the ingredients for success. And I think also found some great examples of projects out there that are doing these things. So, the collective goals with a shared vision, we were looking at one of the project examples in Seattle, the Duwamish Valley program, which is they developed a resilience district to guide massive investments by the city over a 10-year period that sits within an environmental justice community by drawing that environmental justice community into the process. So, there were decades of distrust, and this process really brought some long-term commitment because it was a collaboration through legislation. Also trust building, coalition building. An example we dug into was the Negley Run Watershed Task Force in Pittsburgh, where basically a volunteer coalition with partners, city government, nonprofits came together to envision and start to advance a watershed-based approach that included kind of green infrastructure. And while they had no authority to move forward, they were committed, right, to meeting regularly, and out of that, projects have come. Leadership with authority, this is so critical. I think one of the examples we were looking at was a rebuild program in Philadelphia, where they kind of instituted a tax that could be used in collaboration with city bonds and philanthropy to deliver on public infrastructure projects. And the idea was that the project users sort of build out the project, and then they deliver it back to the city. So it's a bit of a finance mechanism. And then just, I think, critical to understanding whether we've succeeded is having metrics to measure success. And so one of the programs in Austin, the Green Infrastructure Priority Program implementation team, they have a kind of interagency coordination group, and that group is sort of responsible with tracking both annually and every 5 years key metrics around their sort of greening goals around sort of community and school gardens, the distance to parks for residents, water quality improvements, tree canopy coverage, and preservation of land. And then the capacity to work together in the long haul. This is such a challenge. And so in St. Louis, one of the organizations, the Green City Coalition, had a focus on converting vacant lands to community open space. And that basically was a sort of addressing neighborhood disinvestment. And what they turned to was the land trust model, which there are several examples, but this was one of the early ones to keep community ownership in the long run. And then finally, creative funding approaches. We definitely need more of these. And one of the examples that we found was the Denver Climate Protection Fund, which is kind of a sales tax that is focused on implementing the city's climate action plan. So kind of closing on our reflections and lessons learned. As I mentioned, one of our goals was really to share out what we were learning, but also kind of, some of the ideas that we felt like could be for action. So these are kind of 4 key elements that came out of our work on this topic, and really curious if these resonate with your own work. But in terms of collaboration, I think we found that while a lot of people sort of value collaboration, they either, aren't interested, capable, or empowered to lead that change and actually do the work, as well as our administrative systems, don't really create the space for advanced capital planning, or like capital planning in collaboration among multiple agencies with multiple missions. And really the focus is on individual institutions. One other piece that I've sort of observed is just that, bringing a lot of partners together on one issue, like urban greening or tree planting, is possible, right? Or working with one partner on a lot of issues. But it's really difficult to bring together kind of multi-purpose and multi-partner projects and maintain that sort of shared vision. And then the other thing, which I've mentioned earlier, is just the idea of not really speaking the same language, right? So government agencies and communities are sort of speaking in a different language around what climate resilience means and what resilient infrastructure means. So in the lessons learned document, and I'll share a link, there's a lot of examples on the next slide of how we might address this in San Francisco, related to using legislation or developing sort of revolving funds, or really thinking about joint infrastructure development frameworks like a JBA, as well as kind of using the sort of structure of supervisors or others to advance civic engagement. But moving forward, on the last slide, I think that we really feel like that I found that there were kind of these three key overarching goals, for moving this work forward. And I think, we need new ways to have communities and governments partner. We need frameworks for, discussions, and we need to make sure that we can agree and disagree and think about trade-offs. And I hope that we'll have opportunity to really, sort of begin to repair that commons, right? That really feels like it's been a little bit lost, but is really important to moving forward. And so I'll turn it back to Tim to tell us how collaboration and shared governance is playing out in North Richmond.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
We only have 15 minutes
We
left,
only
so I
have
just wanted
15
to see
minutes
if we
left.
can maybe open up to questions, if that sounds good, or maybe Tim doesn't find it yet.
Sure.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry, Tim, I went too long.
No,
Apologies.
no worries. All good.
I think it might be nice for it to just take five or so minutes, and then we can leave the last 10 for questions. Tim.
Okay.
That's totally cool. And I can take way less than 5. I'll just like maybe 2 minutes here of just connecting a little bit of Lisa's collaborative governance thinking here to what we did in North Richmond. This is the first photograph of the first community working group that came together on the shoreline, and just wanted to emphasize that there are community residents in this photograph. There are designers and engineers, and significantly, there are representatives from multiple county agencies. And this was very intentional so that community members were building relationships with agency leaders, and so that kind of capacity was developing for long-term collaboration. And so this is one of our mantras about the work is it's not about project outreach, it's about recruitment to come into this process that's going to have to last quite a while. For decades, the management of nature-based infrastructures just requires a real commitment of a community over time. I've already mentioned before about the co-learning, co-design routine. And then this is just another emphasis on gathering those agency leaders and bringing them to the site, to the community, making sure that there is relationship and like understanding on the ground amongst the regulatory and funding communities about what's happening in the neighborhood and what's coming together there. And this is just a map of the North Richmond region suggesting how critical those relationships are, because there's all these different projects funded through different streams that are all connected both culturally, hydrologically, through their shared vulnerabilities. And so we just really believe strongly that all those sort of collaborative governance aspects that Lisa queued up really need to come to fruition in North Richmond. They have some of the gaps that she already identified here too, but this is sort of like the intended outcome is that we can create this scenario where community members can be leaders at every stage of the project, from its initial advocacy through its design, through its construction, and through its long-term adaptive management of the nature-based infrastructure. Thanks for the slightly extra time to connect back. Appreciate it. Stop there.
No, that was great. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Lisa. Really great. It's a lot to chew on. Let's open it up to a few questions. Maybe just to kick things off, I wonder, Lisa, if you could dig in a little bit to the JBA model and what you found. I guess I'm trying to pull out like what are the innovations you're sort of thinking about here, and maybe what do you wish you could have done if you had a little bit more time. But most governments are required to do a community engagement process. There's open hearings, right? There's things, all these requirements. So are you feeling like those are not sufficient and there needs to be a new governance model? And I'm also just wondering too about the role of new technologies, maybe beyond just getting people in a room. Is there a role of using AI or technology to solicit more community input and accelerating that process? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe my first thought would be it's just not fast. I think the ability to work deeply with communities isn't a fast thing. I think one of the recommendations that comes out of the lessons learned is about instituting kind of community boards. New York City has this community boards that was, instituted, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago at this point. But I think it creates a structure for that relationship between governments and communities that I think is formalized. It has a clear process, and it's hopefully more neighborhood based versus politically based. Because I think a lot of times in our cities, that relationship with government is through political appointees or political electors, a supervisor or a council member. And I think something gets missed when it's not actually, sort of engaged with communities. And I do think that there's kind of two pieces, right? One is really just how do we get our city governments to really play together more nicely, and how do we ensure that process is really drawing in community directly, and to remember that it's work, right? This is work that we're talking about. So as Tim was noting, he's those community members who have engaged in the process have been compensated for that time, and so not everyone is going to be doing that. But I do think that's one way, is to sort of create the structures that actually allow for better direct engagement with our agencies. So those are some of the recommendations that kind of came out of that, and I do think could support this type of, at a city scale, sort of work. I wish there were faster ways, but
Mhm.
I'm curious what Tim would say from his experience too.
I guess I would echo all that. And, one of the mantras we've had in this work is that you have to move at the speed of trust, and you have to work as best you can to align that speed with the speed of funding and the speed of the growing mass of vulnerabilities, which are on its own timeline. And so that's a tough thing to get into alignment, but so far in our work, we have prioritized moving more at the speed of trust, but just because it feels like that foundational effort is what sort of takes the long game into consideration. And it seems like you're moving slower maybe than some other scenarios or other processes, even like when we look across San Francisco Bay of some similar projects that feel like they're closer to implementation than we are. But I wonder, just about the foundational game being in place. So yeah, it's it's tough to go fast in some cases. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Other questions or comments? Anybody want to jump in before we wrap up? All right. I mean, I could go all afternoon or all
Mhm.
morning here, but thank you, Lisa and Tim. I mean, are there any sneak peeks for work you're working on in the future? Anything coming up that you might want to share out, or interesting things kind of coming across your radar? Or
I
any of
guess
the
I appreciate that prompt, Chris. The thing that comes to mind is uh, about a year and a half ago, the San Francisco Bay Development Commission developed their guidelines for planning at the city level for sea level rise adaptation. And now those individual governments are just beginning their processes to align so that there is a kind of cumulative bay-wide resilience that kind of comes through each city exercising these guidelines. And we're helping with some of that effort. And that's sort of, I feel like, at least in the sort of sea level rise, climate change, coastal climate change, groundwater rise, contamination threats, those kinds of coastal edge efforts. That's sort of the thing that's maybe driving most of the work in the Bay Area right now. At this whole other scale from the North Richmond work, and actually a scale jump up from citywide, thinking too. That's pretty fascinating.
That's great, Tim. yeah, it's really interesting to see the local and state leadership and this kind of federal uncertainty, right? The sort of
Yeah.
limitations of what's possible. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
great.
well said. Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody again for joining us. Again, check us out at natura-nat.org, and we'll send out some more communications about any future webinars. I think we'll likely take a pause for the summer, but we'll probably see you back here in the fall for some great more programming. But thanks again to Lisa and Tim, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Yeah, appreciate the
Thanks, Laura.
opportunity. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.